Hello, folks, and welcome to the 8th episode of TalkiNindies, which I always said before wasn't a podcast, but now is sort of a podcast, because you can listen to it aside from on YouTube like before. It should be on most, if not all, podcasting platforms now. So now there's a variety of ways to have me help put you to sleep at night. Anyway, so this week we've got two different questions from two different people, and we'll see what we got. So first one is from a long time. I mean, he must have been one of the original. I swear he was one of the original people who was following me on Twitter. But it's Dan from Canada, and his question is, if you could make a game, what kind of game would that be? For me, I would make an adventure game with a top-down view set in a apocalyptic near future, and the map would be the state of Ohio. That way you get wilderness, coast, a lake, and metro cities. Something like A Link to the Past mixed with some Fallout. Sounds like something I would like. Fallout 3 in particular is definitely one of my favorite all-time games. Still, since Skyrim did well on Switch and definitely ported just fine, I'm still in shock that Fallout 3 has never made it to Switch. New Vegas would also be excellent. But anyway, in terms of game that I would make, I've thought about it before. Since I'm a web design programmer by trade, so programming is something that I have the inclination to do. It's just a matter of trying to figure out, trying to get the inspiration to learn completely different types of programming and all the quirks and all that. And I don't know, when you look at game development, you either have to choose your platform or underlying scheme of choice, Unity, and there's tons of different stuff. So that always seems exhausting in itself, trying to pick, what you'd actually develop in. I suppose people would say, you should start simple, even if it isn't for consumption. If you are going to develop a game, you should start very small and incrementally, set objectives for yourself and create something small that isn't even meant to be for everybody, that you just get working, sort of as a starter success, and then keep building something more complicated from there. I don't know. Fuse is out there for Fuse 4 or Fuse. It's Fuse to the fourth power. And there's actually a game this week that is coming out that it's being branded under Fuse. Somebody had made it in Fuse. It's called Super Funky Bowling, which actually it's a simple. It's visually quite simple. There's not a mistake in that area. It's not a very complicated looking game, but definitely has heavy Super Monkey Ball vibes in terms of how it feels, and it works really well actually. It's proof that if you have a good idea and you are able to execute it pretty well, you can make relatively simple games that are success. I mean, I imagine the majority of the time spent was working out mechanically all the details in terms of the physics of how the ball is rolling around, and getting the controls dialed in to feel really good, because it does all those things really well. And from there, it's a matter of just building different levels and play testing them to feel like they're reasonably difficult. But yeah, very Super Monkey Ball vibe. It's you're controlling a bowling ball, and your objective is to knock out pins. And then there will be a pin that's the golden pin, that's the last one you have to knock out. So yeah, a video goes up for it this week. There's no mistaking it is a clone of the concepts behind Super Monkey Ball. But then again, a lot of the more recent Super Monkey Ball games, to me, have lost their way. So I welcome it. So yeah, if you love Super Monkey Ball and have been feeling that itch, be on the lookout for it this week. But anyway, so it was made in Fuse, which is something that runs on Switch. You can get it yourself, and you could learn how to, within their framework, you can program a game, and it's built. It's an app that's built for doing that. You can go through the code, you can alter it, you can compile it, and play it. So if you've never heard of Fuse, it's definitely interesting. And I experimented with it enough to confirm that yes, indeed, it does work. But that's, even if you have a framework to work with, programming, it takes time, and especially to do something correctly. And that's sort of my hang up, and why I waited so long to build a new site, is I get very, very hung up on even the concept of doing something sort of half-assed. And I really want to be fully committed to something before I put time into it. Because as you can see with this site, everything about this site began with an odd set of circumstances that ended up giving me a code for a game. I won't get into all of it. But once I got that, and then I felt obligated to write something up about it. And then once I did, I also wanted to capture some gameplay footage, and so I decided I would invest in getting a capture card, and put it out there. And it wasn't like, with so much stuff out there, it isn't like anybody noticed at the time, but it was just one of those things that it was like, well, I could just stop now, or I could take this, this one opportunity I was given, and my one review from it, my one bit of gameplay from it, and I could just stop, and I could just go back to just enjoying my games that I buy, or I could start reaching out and start beating the bushes to try to get back on the road to having a website, because way back in the day, that was something I was doing, though I'd always collaborated with other people. But this would just be me. And then, it's one of those things, if you're persistent and you're polite, that is definitely always a big piece of it, and you're flexible. Whenever I write to anybody about games, I'm always clear that I can work with NA, EU, or AU codes. So, I'm very versatile. I'm willing to work with you. I'm not making any demands. There's never, even now, not that I matter, but there's never a presumption of oh, don't you know who I am, or anything like that. And dealing with anybody, it's very, the goal is always to be polite, and to emphasize that, I'm here to help. I'm here to help people find your game. Discovery is notoriously difficult, and it's gotten more and more difficult the longer the Switch has been in place. So, everything in life that means something is about making a decision and making a commitment and being all in. So interesting things happen when you're all in. So that's why I haven't tried to make a game. Getting back to the original point. So anyway, but I have thought about it. The direction I would go in, definitely something that has a roguelike vibe to it, because I love the concept of roguelikes and the way they work. And a lot of the reason for that is they remind me, having grown up in the 80s, I was a big arcade person. Who would have thought? Played just, I can't even imagine how much money I wasted in arcades. But because of that, I really appreciate the way roguelikes tend to work. That there is a focus that feels very arcade-like. Granted, most arcade games you didn't get external progression, which is great when roguelikes aren't so cruel that they don't give you some form of long-term progression. But just the nature of jumping in, doing your best, losing, and dusting yourself up, getting back up, and getting right back in there. I appreciate that piece of it. I like the risk and reward. I used to, another thing I used to do in college, I used to write early programming stuff. They're called they were called MUDs, or or multi-user dungeons. So this is before MMOs. This was MMOs before MMOs existed. People would get together and they would program up these Dungeons and Dragons-esque text-based games. Think like Zork. For people who know what Zork is. But there was a whole community, and you would play through these things, and you'd level up your character. And typically, what would happen is, if you played it long enough and with enough dedication, you could go on quests. And then, for some of these MUDs, once you completed all the quests and passed through a sort of a process, you could become a wizard, which would essentially allow you to start being one of the programmers of the MUD. And I became a wizard on a old school LP MUD called Infinity, and dabbled with some things. I learned programming. It was terrifying that I hadn't really programmed before, but I was interested in it. It's a modified version of C was what they were using, and I found that I was pretty capable. If I chose to do it, I was pretty capable of figuring out how to modify things. And you'd start by setting up your weapons, and you'd set up different simple things. But then if you're more ambitious, you might set up a guild, which took more work. But then I got bored with that, and I actually ended up creating a guild object that would let me create other guild objects quicker, because I wanted to make more guilds as an experiment. So that's what got me started on programming in general. And that's relating back to liking roguelikes. I wasn't a big fan of. I didn't like how little randomness there was in the code, because you'd set up your damage profile on your weapon, say, and there would be a random. You could do from let's say from 4 to 6 damage or whatever. But it was all very generic. So there was generic messaging when you fight, and it was kind of boring to me. And I wanted to introduce, high risk reward kind of stuff. So I would, I'd have like a random 1 in 100 chance that then it would have a different message that was more. I tried to spice it up and make it seem more interesting. And the 1 in 100 times that this would show up, there was also then a small another random chance that you would do a critical hit with it that would give a different message that would do some more ridiculous amount of damage, because it was just I like the unpredictability of it. And when I was doing guilds and stuff, in order to justify having more powerful attacks, there would be a risk component. So that was actually what drove the original guild that I made. Was actually the Cenobite Guild, based on Clive Barker's stuff with the Hellraiser. And it made sense within the context of the Cenobites that if I was willing to sacrifice some of my health, potentially, I could do more damage. So that's why I like roguelikes. I like what's unpredictable about them, and it can be disappointing if you're on the wrong end of, if the RNG gods are not looking down upon you. Certainly, it can lead to disappointing runs, but you have that chance that you're going to have this crazy run, that you hit things right, and it feels so good. And to me, that's a big piece of what makes games more exciting. So roguelike, it would be a roguelike. And since I love twin stick shooters, that seems to also be something that I would pick, something in that vein. part of the appeal of something like a twin stick shooter is you don't need a story. Nobody, you can have one, but nobody really cares. What you want when you're playing a twin stick shooter, you just want to blow stuff up. You want to have a great time. You want it to be intense and fast, and just bring on the enemies. And I want cool weapons, and that's the one thing that I feel like I would experiment with, and it fits into a roguelike concept. Would be to make it so that what you would get, rather than getting a strict gun, so rather than me getting a better gun that has split fire, or it has different properties to it, which ultimately are different weapons. So you have rapid fire guns, you have ones that split, you have let's see, what else you could have ones that power up, you have ones that work like a rocket launcher, so you have explosive damage. There are different sort of main types of guns that people are used to seeing, and they pick them up. But what I would want to do is try to make it so that you would get attributes that you could tack on. So you'd have an attribute like split fire, or you'd have an attribute like explosive damage and stuff like that. But try to find different ways to experiment with how they would work. So if let's say I accumulated 3 of them. So I have split fire, I have explosive damage, and I have actually maybe I have 2 split fires. So I could conceptually, if I set it up, I could set up a progression. So I initially fire it, and it's a 2-way split, and then I tell it to split again and say it splits to 4, but after some pause or some amount of distance, and then I have it be explosive after that. So that would be one outcome, and that's pretty effective. I mean, that would be pretty good damage dealing, clear the room kind of idea. But let's say that I had it be explosive first. So maybe what that does, it does like area damage around me, and that makes it split in all directions. And then I have that second split, and that's going to make it split even more. So I have a area of effect kind of deal to begin with that could help save me. And then then I get my all directions spray split. It's become a spray split, and then I split it on top of that. But if I had it split first and then I had it be explosive, well, now I've got explosive damage that's ahead of me that is splitting in all directions when it does the explosive shot. So it's taking ideas like that, and this is one of the things. That's why I wouldn't, unless you develop it and you spend the time to walk through how all these things work. Maybe the idea doesn't even work. Until you would test it, you wouldn't know if this idea would work. But if you did a lot of things like that, poison bullets obviously would be an option. I mean, there's a lot of things like that, or fire. But then, imagine playing with fire and ice, or so you have elemental stuff that applies. Just taking all these different attributes. But the roguelike piece of it, and where the risk and reward would come in, would be that once you use it, you can't combine it again. So the idea would be, okay, so I'm going to pick up these attributes, and I've got 2 of them that are really good, and I'm feeling like I'm in trouble. So I really need to invest, and I need to just get something to get me going. So, but maybe I end up having to sacrifice because of that. I have to sacrifice like my explosive damage, or I have to sacrifice my split. These are really powerful things potentially when combined, but I need to survive right now. So my risk was I was holding on to these to this point. My reward is I now have more effective, a more effective weapon because I've enhanced my weapon with these 2 things. But now maybe then I got this. The next attribute I picked up was poison or something. And oh my God, if I had just held on a little longer and survived, I could have had all 3. So now I'm sitting here and I'm accumulating again, and I'm trying to figure out, when I need to commit. Because the whole idea is that I guess it's part of the idea is that it's time based. Like, these things don't all fire at once. So something starts out as something, then within a very short interval, the next one would trigger. Then within the next an interval, the next one would trigger. So this is, it's like you'd have to probably set a limit. Maybe you can only use 3 or 4 or something, because obviously at some point you could make yourself so powerful that it would probably be game breaking. But once you think about that system, so maybe I set it up so that it fires as a single poison bullet, then it hits explosive damage and turns into multiple projectiles, and then on top of that, then the last one is a monster seeker kind of thing. So you've got this, so you fire forward with a poison bullet, which obviously anything it hits is going to poison it, and then it's going to explode and go into multiple directions, and then on top of that, all those projectiles are going to seek enemies. Obviously, you'd have to put sort of a damage limit, because these things couldn't kill everything on the screen outright. But the idea is just there to try to make it so that weapons and the way you handle weapons and the way you think about them isn't so predictable. That there are different possibilities, there are different combinations that you're going to come up with, and until you try them, you wouldn't know what the result would be, because maybe some of these, if you combine them in certain ways, maybe it's actually disappointing. Maybe you had high hopes for putting a delay on the explosive being fourth in, but it just doesn't do enough damage, and it would be more beneficial to put it earlier where it's going to split it up. There's these different ideas of how you could approach it. And then, of course, if you're doing roguelike, the way to make it the way to make the game tougher is you make the rules roughly the same in reverse, that your enemies are unpredictable as well, perhaps, and maybe it's by zone or whatever, and maybe you describe the zone so you give people a taste of what the enemies are going to be doing. But yeah, maybe the counter to this is that the enemies have these kinds of really powerful things that are combined, so maybe their fire is a bit more unpredictable. And of course, all this, you'd have to figure out how to balance it. You'd have to figure out how to make things work. Obviously, if the enemies are going to have, potentially these crazy combinations of things, aside from offensive abilities, you're going to need pretty heavy defensive abilities to help counteract some of this. And maybe that's one of the other things that you have. Maybe you have a armor system. Maybe things like attributes, you have choices that I can either take the poison attribute and it's something I fire and makes them do more damage with poison, or I invested in my armor and so now I'm immune to poison, or at least partially immune to poison. And maybe that makes it even more roguelike, that it becomes, the armor becomes the same kind of thing, that the more things I accumulate and hold on to, the more powerful my armor will be if I can survive long enough to use it. So maybe that's the balance, that all attributes sort of apply to either or, and you can go in a defensive direction, you can go in an offensive direction. You might get attributes that on a run that you could get nothing that really feels like it's going to help you offensively, so you're sort of stuck with this great defense that you're taking forever to do chip damage to take out enemies until you finally get something that feels like it's a match. Is that a failed run? Is that good? Well, I mean, it's definitely roguelike. So it's these ideas. So if I did a game, that's definitely the one that I've spent the most time sort of pondering in the back of my head. Never really at the foreground. But it seems like it would be a fun idea. Like I said, absolutely could not work. You might make it where it's too easy, too hard, and or too wildly one to the next, that these things become so powerful, your enemies or you are, that it becomes pointless. So you'd have to figure out how to balance all that. But I think that's the idea that I would run with. I just like the idea of there being this experimentation for people up front. Now, granted, they could just look up a guide and it would ruin it all, as people discover what all the different progressions give you. But I like that idea that there's an unknown. You take these things that are known: split fire, explosive damage, poison damage, heat-seeking stuff. You take all these elements that people are used to and they understand, but by making different combinations of things and by changing the order that they execute in, you can get wildly different effects. So you take the familiar and you make it feel new. I don't know. Sounds like it would be fun, but also a lot of work, and don't know how well it would work, because I play a lot of games that that have great ideas. You can tell there was a great seed of an idea here, and you're on the journey with that developer, and you're feeling it. You're like, yes, this is a great idea. I can really grab onto this, and this is something that I could be really excited about. But then in execution, either by fault of theirs or by simple fact that maybe the idea is not possible to execute as you had in mind, it falls apart. That happens, and it happens with all forms of entertainment. You have TV shows, movies, books on that at the elevator pitch level, it sounds brilliant, or it sounds like it has a lot of potential, but for whatever reason, either the talent you have involved or the direction that it takes, or maybe even just the time. Maybe you've got shows and games that are ahead of their time. Maybe the public isn't ready for that yet. It's like a great example is a game I bring up regularly, Tumbleseed. I think it's a brilliant idea, and it's very different, and I enjoy it. But it's one of those things that, whether it's ahead of its time or whether it can't have its time, things that are different and that are unexpected, it's a risk. I mean, people don't latch on to that. People don't want something that's unfamiliar. They should. I wish more people would be more thirsty for games that feel different, but they aren't. They look at the success of things like Madden, Madden not so much lately, but Call of Duty, things that are come out every year. It's an experience that you understand and you know what to expect. There's a lot of comfort in those things. So when you have a game that shakes it up, it makes it tough. So that's the end of first question. We have one more question from Grillz Von Sizzle, another person who's been around. So he says, "Hey Justin, long-time listener, 1000th time caller. It seems like the indie gaming landscape has shifted since the Switch's early days. Do you attribute this to the Switch's tech limitations or a lack of visibility in the oversaturated eShop? What changes would you make?" Couple questions here, and a couple of them are tough ones. Definitely things have changed. I would say that in terms of the indie scene, but I think on the console scene, and this shouldn't be a shock to anybody, the Switch is past its prime in terms of its power and in terms of it being at peak. It's seen the majority of its potential already. And that isn't to say that you can't still have great games on it and games shouldn't be made for it, and that Nintendo should immediately be talking about their next release. But it's definitely past its peak. You can feel it in the releases. This used to be it's still a pretty busy time of year, but compared to past years, things haven't been as busy on my end. And it's incremental. Maybe it's only 20% less or something like that. But you feel it. In terms of there was the early days. It was, can this be on Switch was the common call. There got to be a point where you stopped having to ask. You could just, there was a period of a year or two where you could just assume everything was coming to Switch, pretty much. But now we're back to having to ask in a lot of cases, and it seems like even the indie development scene, there's a class of games that have moved on beyond what the Switch is probably capable of, and so people don't. People just know that it's probably not going to be Switch bound, and those aren't all games that are necessarily a huge loss, particularly. But obviously, the more games that aren't coming to Switch, the more opportunity for something being big is being lost. And indie developers of a lot of stripes are probably still inclined to try to make a release on Switch because of the installed base and because of, traditionally the Switch has been pretty good to a lot of indie games. But yeah, it's definitely on its decline. In terms of, whether because of the Switch's technical limitations, I think it's that to a degree. But honestly, the Switch came out of the gate. The Switch came out of the gate limited, and it's just one of those things that, either you're making games that can fit within those limitations, perhaps with some nudging, because we've seen, really good games be adapted and come over surprisingly well. Like Doom comes to mind. It astounds me how well Doom came across. But then you've got games that are in potentially the same vein that really didn't translate well, like BPM is one that's more recent. Bullets per minute, boy, visually, they got the speed right. It feels good from a speed perspective, but murkiness, visually, just really hard to make out what you're doing. It was kind of a mess. So, not to say it's the fault of the Switch completely. I think that probably it could have been ported better, but that isn't to say that there wouldn't be a hard limit on. At some point, you're going to lose something translating to Switch, and that's always been a known. And it's just the longer things have gone on, the more potential there is to be lost. And because you've got people shooting for, what are now a new generation past, when the Switch was launched, where the competition is, obviously things have moved ahead quite a bit. So there is definitely a technical side to it. But I think the oversaturation in the eShop, to a degree, is true too. But let's, the Steam catalog is just, the Nintendo, I think Nintendo is over, the Switch is over 7,000 games. It might actually be pushing her over 8 at this point. So that's a lot, and it's a lot to get through. And part of the problem, when we get to Discovery, the eShop really is not ideal. The eShop is very good at helping people know what just came out, but it is horrible for discovery. Once games have sort of had their time of maybe as quick as a week or two, with the exception of really massive AAA games. But for indie games, you might not have ever gotten noticed in the first place, even when you came out. But certainly, a month in, it's impossible to find you unless you know what you're looking for. And that's where sites like mine are trying to be helpful and to try to beat the drum for games that are, may not be perfect, and may not be all AAA quality or even anywhere near AAA quality. But, with my, now Hall of Fame, certainly Nindie choice, and then even to some degree my quote good rated games, there's a threshold basically of about 7.5 is a way to think about it. If a game is 7.5 or above, longer term I'll have it in things like steals and deals videos if they go on sale. If they're they may show up in bigger lists like genre lists and stuff like that, but ultimately that's a matter of what genre you're in. You've got oversaturated lists like shooters and action. The longer those lists have been there, because I'm gonna cap that at 100 at any time, and now I'm even capping the videos at 50, and then on the site I'm going up to 100. But so if you're a 7.5 sports game, yeah, you can easily get in the top list because there's plenty of room. The sports, there's not a lot of representation. But if you're in the action or shooter category, say, well, that's a lot of competition. Action, to get onto the top 100 for action, I can pretty much guarantee you have to be at an 8, and even then you'd probably have to be a really good 8. You're probably more, the games are getting down into somewhere between 8 and 8.5. It's getting more competitive because there's just so many really great action games that sort of getting into that list is going to be a lot more difficult than on underrepresented genres like I said, sports, racing, simulations, things like that. So in terms of what to do about it, that also goes back to the days of when Kirk Scott was at Nintendo. That was one of the things we would spend some time talking about. A few times. Not to say that we talked tons. I wouldn't imply that you had ongoing conversations by any means, but of the things that we would talk about when we talked, discovery was definitely an ongoing problem. And as I covered in a previous episode of this, there was a time when there was talk of just spitballing about a Game Pass kind of subscription service that would include indies in some fashion, whether it was indie focused or it was indies were a piece of some bigger subscription idea. And this was before Nintendo Online, so this is all just hypothetical, just going through conceptually how things could work, whether it would work. But the discovery was definitely a piece of that, because part of the idea would be that you could, so you've got a game, you're an indie developer and you have a reasonably good game that did reasonably well, but the game came out, let's say 8 months, a year more ago, so you've seen your numbers have definitely waned. So if you have a program like Game Pass-ish type of thing, that you're an add-on, at the point that unless you're a high demand indie game, you would only be an add-on to this month's crop. But what it does is it allows new people to see your title. You might be able to convert some of that into sales after the fact. That people might love your game that they played for free enough that now they're going to pay for it once it's out of its rotation in the queue. But then also part of that deal is now you have visibility. You're being sort of pushed, even if not actively. Just the fact that you're included, more eyes are on you. It has value potentially to you for rejuvenating your numbers. But things like that, I think, would be one way to help improve. Like I said, if Nintendo, they have almost the perfect answer at their fingertips with their online subscription piece. They're choosing to emphasize their back catalog, which is obviously they have tons of material, and they could absolutely continue to release games for different consoles that they've had over time, and that would be appealing in its own right. But wetting the beak of some indies along the way would seem to be a good idea. To partner to really get some of these indie developers to feel like they matter, and to help shed light on them. It seems like a weird move, because when Kirk and I would talk about the indie focused piece, it was like, well, what is the, how do you get somebody like Devolver, or one of these bigger publishers that make bigger indie games, the likes of so Devolver, recently they had Cult of the Lamb, or certainly Dotemu with Streets of Rage 4, or with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge. I mean, these are sort of higher visibility, higher demand indie games that you'd have to make a deal to get those to be part of the pack, obviously. But that was always the challenge, is like, how do you incentivize the situation so that the big games that are the draw can pull people in, and then you're bringing along other people that are all the games that they necessarily haven't heard of, that you're trying to help promote, that are decent. Nintendo Online sort of solves that problem. The draw is Nintendo's own products. So the extras, you're telling me that Nintendo couldn't talk to indie developers that have, like I said, games that are 1, 2, 3 years deep, old, that they couldn't go back to some of these developers and say, hey, why don't we run you for a month on Nintendo Switch Online, make you available for free, see if it can drum up some positive buzz for you and get people excited, and then perhaps at the end of that period, offer your game to the people that are on the subscription service at a discounted rate to keep it. That's a revenue opportunity. Maybe you think that that's a risk. Maybe indie developers like, no, I'll take my chances. But there's an opportunity there. It seems weird that Nintendo isn't doing that if they still have a commitment to indies. That seems like something you would do if you were committed. But I can't speak, since Kirk's no longer there. I don't talk to anybody at Nintendo about indies. So I like the fact that they keep doing the directs. But it feels like there could be more. And it feels odd that there isn't. And that may not be the problem of the people who are in charge of indies at Nintendo. That could be a bigger Nintendo problem, because as I talked about in the past, indies and Nintendo from a home office corporate perspective, indie games weren't always so highly thought of, and perhaps without somebody, a champion like Kirk Scott specifically, who had tons of charisma and stuff like that. Maybe without somebody like that being the one beating down your door to get something to happen, maybe it doesn't happen. Maybe even if people are really interested, they can't get the higher end folks to agree. But it does seem like a missed opportunity. The other way to go, but they killed that themselves, was really early in the eShop. They briefly had the ability for games to be rated by people, and they killed that, and they never brought it back. That seems like another thing you could tie to Nintendo Online. I mean, I think the only reason you kill a rating kind of thing on the a user rating system, I think one of the only reasons you kill it is because you don't think that the results will be legitimate, which, if you made it anonymous, certainly would be a problem, because then you can get people exploiting and review bombing things, or like Amazon has problems with people uprating things illegitimately to make them look better. But it seems like when you have things like Nintendo Switch Online, that audience is definitely a curated audience that you could put stuff into the people's terms of use, that if they try to abuse it, you can rescind their membership, type of thing. But that's a curated audience that, why not let people, you can keep it really simple, don't have a point system. I think what Netflix does now makes sense with a downvote, upvote, or a double upvote. I think having two levels of your endorsement is a smart move without being too crazy. I don't think a double negative would be beneficial. I think then it's just people being sort of mean. You can not like something, and that's enough. You don't need to measure how much you dislike something. I don't know if that's very effective, but I think Netflix going to the one thumb up, two thumb up was a smart move, because I might like something. It's the difference between liking and loving, and so I would feel the conflict sometimes when I was sort of on a movie or a show or something like that. And maybe from an algorithm standpoint, I liked it enough that I want Netflix and their algorithm to know that I'm interested in this sort of thing, but I just don't want them to think that I thought it was the shit. So that's where the double thumbs up is. That's truly something I love versus something that I liked it. But again, that would be an opportunity that Nintendo would have at their fingertips to create a way of improving discovery, and it would be based. It would be very arbitrary. You'd be counting on the recommendations of random people that went back through their libraries and put in these ratings and stuff like that. Oh, and that's the other benefit of the having it tied to your Nintendo Online account, would be the fact that then you would not allow people to you wouldn't allow people to evaluate games that you didn't know they purchased. And since your online account is very aware of all the games that you have in your library, obviously they could easily restrict it. So they've got the answer there, or the means of an answer there. They just aren't using it. So that would be the other way. But yeah, the fact they do nothing and have done nothing is disappointing. And it's not just for indie developers, just for even bigger developers. There are less known games in the libraries of even bigger developers that they would probably appreciate there being an opportunity for somebody to find without getting word of mouth external to the site and then searching for it. Discovery is a consistent problem. The other model they could take, and you've got people like me out here that have opinions on a lot of games. But it's something that Steam does. So they have community curators. And what's nice about those is you can latch on to specific community curators that you feel that you align with better. So that's another opportunity that's out there that they aren't taking up. It's, I guess, frustrating that they seem to be doing none of it. And just seem to be content to just let it be. That is disappointing. But anyway, so that brings us to a close for the questions. We don't have any questions for next week, so I would appreciate anybody listening if you like this setup and me covering whatever people ask about Nintendo games, whatever. Please ask a question, because that's the only way this survives. It's set up to be just a way of answering questions and sort of engaging with people. So hopefully you enjoyed it, and hopefully you'll tune back in. And if you have a question, hopefully you'll submit it, because without that, there won't be any more. So I guess I'll talk to you all next time. This has been TalkiNindies. My name is Justin Nation, and we'll talk to you next time.